Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back. I hope the lunch was delicious and you're feeling energized for the remaining sessions of the day. So we're now moving into our next session with Ben Eyre from Global Witness, who's going to be presenting on reporting and investigating critical minerals mining and production. And Ben, over to you. Thank you so much. Let's give him a round of applause. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And yeah, I hope you're all feeling good after lunch and that, yeah, I can keep you awake with the post-lunch slump. Is this working? Yeah? Okay. So, yeah, I've been honoured by the invitation to come speak about this issue today. I want to start with a little bit of an introduction to Global Witness for those who aren't familiar with us. We are a long-standing international NGO, increasingly long-standing. This year is going to mark our 30th anniversary, with a history of working on natural resource exploitation, conflict and corruption issues. We have not done a lot of work on critical mineral mining and production, and it really is quite a new area for us. But I think as an organisation, we're well positioned to come into this space because we have a lot of relevant historical expertise, and we have a lot of other current campaigns which intersect with this area and which are quite relevant. Those include work on fossil fuel extraction, forest degradation. We also have bodies of work on the digital space, digital threats to democracy. Sorry, I'm going to keep my hands away from the mic. And in terms of the way that we work through partnerships, and we really focus on finding the facts. I like the way that Tom introduced the session this morning and the focus that he put on being factual and focusing on the real evidence behind the issues that we're digging into here. That's something that's been at the heart of our organization's approach for a long time. Bringing that truth to light through different means. We have public reports. We also work with policymakers to influence change. And yeah, that latter point being the final step in our process is attempting to influence the systems that govern these supply chains, with critical minerals being no exception. So that's a little bit on our history, but what I want to talk about today is how we're approaching this issue of reporting on critical minerals. And I'm hopeful that it could be useful to share some of our reflections as we've come into this space and started to think about how we approach the issue, and that maybe some of those reflections might be useful to others in this room, and particularly to some of the journalists who are coming to the issue relatively fresh. So I'm going to opt for a question-led approach to this presentation and just talk through some of the thinking that we've done. Feel free to interrupt me or ask questions throughout the presentation. We'll also have time for a Q&A at the end. But these are some of the overriding questions, and rather than unpacking them here, I'm just going to get stuck in. The first being, what is the context that surrounds the issue in question? And by that, I mean, I'm going to touch on some of the complexity that we've already unpacked this morning through Gerard and Dr. Shen and Dr. Chimbang. Sorry, I've not got it written down. I'm going to trip up on. Thank you very much. It's funny. It's fine when you're not stood at the front of the room, but as soon as you're in front of a mic, totally stumbled. Thank you. As we've seen, these are really complex issues, and I think that there's a balance to be struck when reporting on these issues. You want to keep a degree of simplicity that's accessible to audiences, that passes editorial approval, and that feels relevant to those that you're speaking to. But we also have to get under the skin of some of these supply chains, understand the demand and the supply scenarios, understand the players who are involved, understand the rate of technical change that really affects these issues. And so digging into that has been really informative to our team, and I think that some of the resources that we've been using and some of the data sets that we've been using might hopefully be useful to you too. There's a real wealth of information, kind of a slightly staggering degree of documentation, reporting, and data sets that you can get stuck into when you're tackling these issues. But some of the ones that have been most useful to us are the United States Geological Survey. They publish these incredible yearly compendiums of mineral production and resources and reserves, but also some of the derived products that other publishers have put out, including the International Energy Agency, a screenshot of their critical minerals market review being on screen here. And the reason that I've brought this up is because I think that it can be quite difficult to, despite the call to action that we had from Gerard earlier, to keep the major producers of each given mineral in mind when you're doing this work. It's a bit overwhelming. There's a lot of different dynamics in these supply chains. There are a lot of different producing jurisdictions, a lot of different minerals. And if you're not dealing with it day in, day out, if it's not your sole area of expertise, it can be quite a challenge. So I think having resources at hand that you can have a reliable source and say, okay, I'm really interested in a story about manganese. I want to know what the global context of production looks like. And I want to get into it not just at the level of like, well, what was produced last year, but I want to know where the resources are, where the reserves are, who owns them, and what the future might look like. I would really recommend anyone dealing with those kinds of questions to reach out for these resources and try and contextualize the issue that you're looking into. So if you're asking a question about where does Africa sit in the current global space of lithium production, then the answers are relatively well documented. I think it's fair to say that there is uncertainty in all of this stuff. And there's an example that I'm going to come on to later on, an investigation that we did into rare earth mining in Myanmar, where we found that actually all the official documentation that we were seeing from the USGS massively underestimated what we were seeing being produced in Myanmar, because the rate of expansion had outpaced formal reporting and documentation. So I don't regard any of these sources as definitive, and it's really worth digging into how they're compiled and how they're put together. But I think it's really useful for anybody, as I say, to get to grips with the basics, particularly if you're doing an investigation or a report focused on a specific mineral. I think it really builds credibility, and it helps you to contextualize the work that you're doing to understand where else it might be being produced, by whom, what the future prospects look like. And with that, you might find some interesting stories in their own right. I mean, it was mentioned earlier, I think, by Tom, that there's been this huge upswell of nickel production in Indonesia that many hadn't really anticipated, that the production methods that are being used there are actually somewhat novel and more hazardous than we would really like to see. The implications of that production also have knock-on effects for the cobalt sector, because cobalt is going to be a byproduct of that production. And having that context, I think, is really important to make sense of the work that you're doing. And the other side of the coin is the demand side. And I think it's again pretty overwhelming when you look down these massive lists of critical minerals. We're like, okay, you kind of, for me, when I would first approach the topic of critical minerals, I'd think, well, it must be a relatively small handful in order for them to have that sense of criticality. But the lists are huge, and breaking down what is meant by criticality, as Dr. Shen was inviting us to do so earlier, is, I think, a really important exercise, and one that merits being undertaken for a given report or for a given piece of work that's being done. So one of the ways that I've found it really useful to think about the critical minerals that are most used or most required by the energy transition is to think about what are the steps involved in the energy transition. We've got power generation being largely solar panels and wind turbines. You've got power storage, we're talking about batteries. You've got transmission, and you've got utilization. And if you break it down into those 4 bits, you can quite quickly get it feels a little bit more manageable. And you can quite quickly see which minerals are being used, what the reliance is, and who is processing them, and where the power sits. And I'm not going to try and hammer all this stuff home in this talk, but what I'd like to do is to give everyone else in the room a sense that these things are quite easy to go and find. You don't have to memorize all of it. You can think about it in a modular way, and you can bring, when you are working on a report or an investigation, these are the types of questions to ask is why are we talking about copper and aluminium? It's probably, if it's in the context of the energy transition, it's because we're talking about transmission and the build out of a new grid. And then there might be an interesting kind of part to your story about where that grid is going to be built, or where the major demand for new grid infrastructure is, or who's benefiting. Are all the new grids being built in the US and the EU, or are these grids being built in the African continent? And if so, what does that mean for copper exports from Africa if everything's just going into grids elsewhere? Power utilization is a really interesting one because it largely boils down to rare earth elements, which are themselves quite an impenetrable field. If you get into it, the technicalities that surround what is a rare earth element, I mean, there are 15 of them when you look at the periodic table. It feels quite overwhelming. But what it really boils down to is that we need magnets to run motors in cars, and we need magnets in the transmissions of wind turbines, largely when they're offshore, because we want them to require less maintenance, so we put these big magnets in them, and the magnets have to perform at high temperatures. So then the minerals that allow them to do that become critical, and that is, what's meant by criticality in that context. And I think, as I say, that unpacking that can be really, really helpful for developing an understanding of the story that you're working on. And the second part of that question is, for whom? So again, with the United States Geological Survey, they quite helpfully center their publications around US needs. And they give you a map in their annual report that shows basically which other countries they're relying on for their mineral imports, because it's a security risk for them. So, they're concerned about the critical nature of these minerals, and they want to ensure that they have sufficient access, so they pay great attention to the sources. We can unpack these relationships in various ways, but again, if you're quite early on in a project, you're scoping out your research, I'd really encourage you to look at bilateral trade data, to look at information recorded by the UN about what is traded from one place to the next, and who the major buyers are for the potential commodities and contexts that you're focusing on. What I've got on screen here is a representation of exports of what are defined as specialty metals on a website called resourcetrade.earth, which is an easy kind of portal that you can use to access some of this data. And you can quite quickly start to see the downstream countries that are buying these metals from, in this case, sub-Saharan Africa, but largely coming out of South Africa. You can go beyond this, and one thing that I think is particularly useful for this area that we're discussing today is the import data that's published by the Chinese General Administration of Customs. This might be a little bit in the weeds, and if you don't think it's relevant right now, but later think of it and decide that you might want to explore it, please do just send me a message, because I've spent a lot of time looking at this stuff. But the reason it's interesting is that China publish on a monthly basis an incredibly detailed description of what they're importing. And they define it not at the level of we're importing cobalt, but at the level of we're importing cobalt at a grade of 18% or 18 to 25, you know, and so on. And that might sound a little bit nerdy and a little bit like, yeah, technical, but it can be really useful if you're looking into a specific company and there aren't a great many companies producing that commodity. You can quite quickly start to see where those dependencies exist and how they've changed over time and what happened last month compared to this, and the volumes and values that are being exchanged. And by that, you can then determine, you know, what is the relative value of the commodity this month versus last? How does the relative value compare for trades from the DRC versus South Africa, for instance? Where perhaps is value being added in the supply chain? So where are you trading cobalt as a wrought metal rather than a concentrate? These are the types of questions that I think can really enrich some of these investigations to find new avenues and explore new directions. And you can go beyond that too, because quite a lot of countries actually publish per shipment trade data. So you can get an understanding of the companies that are involved. And I think this is something that the work that Gerard has undertaken is really doing justice to in the context of copper and cobalt in the DRC. The next kind of overarching question is this one, which is, where are the operations that we're talking about? What are the physical assets that underpin these supply chains? Who owns them? How long have they existed? How long are they going to exist? And this again is a really it's a deep area of research. And I think it's somewhere that, you know, it's important that we get it right in our reporting. It's important that we understand how many assets there are producing lithium in the country that we're focusing on. And it is accessible because a lot of the information is published by the companies that are doing it. But that's not entirely true. There are a lot of state-owned companies that don't publish a lot of information. And so our tendency, and one of the reflections we've had, is that we should, to an extent, start from some of the databases that already exist in the ecosystem that attempt to compile all of this information. And you start there and you say, okay, we're gonna look at all of the lithium mines in Africa. And then as we dig in, we recognize that by virtue of being a compilation, they're not necessarily as detailed or as accurate as we might need for our specific case. So then we rely on more primary sources. And for those who are interested, I'm really happy to talk about this more, but we've gone through all of the commercially available and publicly available data sets on this issue and compiled them, assessed their quality, assessed their coverage. And so we can share that too, and I'd be happy to talk to anyone here who's interested in that data. This screenshot doesn't really convey what I was hoping it would, because the contrast is a little bit low, but it's actually showing all of the mining projects in sub-Saharan Africa that are deemed to be part of the battery supply chain. And so down the left-hand side, although it's really not that discernible, you have the different minerals, and you can dig in and look at a specific case, this one being the Uis mine in Namibia, which was the focus of a report that Global Witness published about 2 weeks ago now, or one of the focuses. And I know that we've talked about this a little bit already, and I'm conscious with this entire presentation that I want to tread the line between the technicalities and what's most relevant to our audiences and the content that's going to get traction. But I think there's something that's really important for everybody to take to heart about investigating mines at different stages in their life cycle. So not only where is lithium being produced right now, but where has it been identified? What does that mean for the future prospects of production? What might that mean for the future prospects of greater value addition and value capture in the country or region that that mine exists in? And also, yeah, what are the possible pathways forwards for that project? Because arguably, when you're at that early stage of exploration and discovery, there's an awful lot more that might be possible in terms of steering the future prospects of the project and looking for more equitable approaches. So I would encourage those of you who don't feel comfortable with some of the terminology and concepts to to maybe explore some of those different stages of production, pre-feasibility, when a mine actually gets permission, it's got a definitive feasibility, it goes into production. But there's also a whole lot of issues that we might be interested around the kind of closure of mines as well that merits attention. One of the things that I learned quite early on looking into this issue is that there are, if due process is to be followed, incredibly long lead times for some of these mines to come to production. And one of the things that we've been interested in recently is where those lead times and those processes are actually being perverted or disrupted in the interests of rapid exploitation. So looking at where a mine, and this one is a very good example as it turns out, has permission to explore an area, they don't have permission to produce, but they go ahead regardless. And so that's super critical to the reporting and the investigation then, because you're able to say not only is there lithium being produced here, but they really simply don't have permission as per the documentation that they've got. So this mine in question looked something like this in July of this year. And by September, it looked like this. And it does, as I said, have a permit for exploration. The owners acquired one. I think the means by which they acquired it and the amount they paid for it is something of a problem, a contested issue. But what they certainly don't have permission to be doing is kind of industrial scale extraction of lithium. And digging into this specific case revealed a whole bunch of issues. And not least being that, so where lithium is concerned, there's obviously different ways in which you can process and add value to the commodity prior to the point of export. And I guess if you go further down the step, you're talking about battery production and even electric vehicle production. But early on, there's a rough expectation that when you're dealing with hard rock lithium, we have brines in South America, a lot of the rest of the production that we're looking at is going to be, hard rock, which is what we're seeing here. There's a rough expectation that you refine the commodity to a certain degree, and there are standards. So there's when you come across the term spodumene concentrate being shipped, it's expected that you ship it at roughly 6% lithium content, and that's the kind of industry standard. There's a practice that is kind of emergent and exists in various places to directly ship the ore. And you see this in company filings where they refer to it as DSO. And it basically means they don't do any refining, there's no processing, there's no value addition whatsoever. They dig the stuff out the ground, they dump it on a bulk carrier, the same kind of big ships that you use for moving iron ore, and they transport it directly. And certain companies are using DSO, they're justifying DSO on the basis that it provides the startup capital for their operations and that they'll subsequently invest it in an expensive processing facility, and therefore they will bring value back into the country. But I think claims like that really do deserve scrutiny. And in this case, we found that the company responsible for this mining had been issued with a ban, an order to cease and desist with their exports of lithium in this form, and they'd carried on. And this brings me, I think, to my next stage, which is going to be about the supply chain. But before I move on, there's something that I want to share on company operations, mining operations, and the different stages in their life cycle, which is that a lot of these companies are publicly listed. So we obviously have a lot of state-owned involvement, particularly from the Chinese side, not exclusively, but largely. And you have state involvement from some of the producer jurisdiction countries. But there are a lot of Western companies, largely based on the Australian Stock Exchange. I think there's roughly 1,000 mining companies on there, and roughly 2,000 on the Canadian Stock Exchange. And if you're interested in this space and you start to follow these companies, it really does merit digging into the rules and regulations that they are governed by in order to remain on those exchanges. Because they are required to do certain things in order to get their mines forward, including environmental impact assessments and engagement with local communities. And it is often the case that isn't happening, but there are means by which, at least in principle, these companies can be held accountable for that. It's also the case that because of those stipulations, there's a large body of documentation surrounding a lot of these companies. Some of it perhaps insufficiently detailed, some of it perhaps falsified or erroneous, but therein potentially lies some stories. There was a case that I saw some weeks back that really caught my attention, where one of them, and I forget which, so I'm not going to get into the details, but I can look it up if someone's particularly interested in it. They had uploaded their environmental impact assessment with the comments still in the margin. And one of the companies, because a lot of this stuff is outsourced, the mining company will say, we need an environmental impact assessment, we're going to get this third party to do it for us. The comments from that third party were very much of the nature of, this is insufficient, this doesn't match our findings. They were flagging clear issues with the mining operation up front, and they'd accidentally uploaded it into the public domain. Now, that's perhaps a really rare case, but I do think for those of us who are interested in that kind of company level reporting, it really does merit exploring whether for the case that you're interested in, some of that information exists, because it is quite a rich seam of data and intel. The next question that we've been asking ourselves whenever we're getting into or scoping out a piece of work in this space is who is in the supply chain. And that can be quite an overwhelming question in itself, but I think there are a few entry points that are perhaps more or less accessible. And some of them I think will be familiar off the bat. We're well aware of some of these operations being the result of vertical integration. You've got companies, a lot of the Chinese state companies that are buying up producers upstream such that they can secure resources for their operations. You also have offtake agreements wherein a refiner, processor, manufacturer agrees with an upstream producer that they will secure supply in exchange for certain terms, financial terms or otherwise. You have active trade, and this comes back to some of the stuff I was talking about earlier, where it is possible for certain supply chains to get hold of information about the companies that are operating within them. Certain countries publish customs declarations that detail the exporters, the importers, the locations, and the commodities in question. And that data can have surprising information inside it. Like you can find information about the specific subcommodities, how they're being produced, and that can allow you to tie it back to a given mine. It's often quite possible to do more than you might expect on that side of things. And then the fourth one is that for some of these supply chains, there are industry-wide implications. So this comes back to, and this is why I've included this image on the right-hand side, which is an image that we had in the report we published on rare earth production in Myanmar. Because in essence, so much of the rare earth processing capacity exists in China, that for any manufacturer buying rare earth derived products, permanent magnets, in the Chinese sector, you are inherently exposed to the sources of supply. That supply chain was found to be so concentrated that it was almost a shifting of the burden of proof onto the manufacturers. So rather than saying innocent until proven guilty, we found that it was really very difficult for any of these companies to make the case that they knew they were not buying from these mines in Myanmar. And I can talk a little bit more about that in a minute, but it does make for some interesting advocacy opportunities alongside the reporting. And to come back to the mine that we were just talking about in Namibia and the direct shipping, I've got an example here which might hopefully bring it to life for you a little bit more, which is that we knew that this company had shipped roughly 55,000 tons of ore on a handful of occasions. And so we took to Marine Traffic, which is a commercial database that lists basically every ship over 300 tons and tracks its location. And we found suitable vessels that had arrived at Walvis Bay in Namibia, and we quite quickly identified the boats that had been used to carry this lithium. And on the right-hand side was something that surprised me, because when I looked up one of these boats, I just punched it into Google, and I found somebody celebrating on LinkedIn its arrival into port in China and detailing the buyer of the shipment. And so this might feel like perhaps, you know, an anecdotal thing or, a rare case. But I do think there is a lot to be said for digging into the specifics and trying to understand the dynamics of the supply chains, not just because it's possible, but also because it helps you to situate where power exists in those supply chains. And it helps you to identify potential, for want of a better word, targets for some of the reporting that you're going to do. There's going to be a lot more traction if you identify a case where a company that really values and cares about its reputation, perhaps for Western markets, has an issue in its supply chain. There was a case I saw just this morning, I don't know how recently it was published, but BMW are responding to an allegation that there is arsenic poisoning nearby to a cobalt mine that it uses in Morocco. And it clearly chose to stop sourcing cobalt from the DRC because of concerns about its reputation, and it's now addressing these concerns in Morocco. And the response from BMW is largely there because it has that public-facing reputation to uphold and can therefore be quite a powerful actor to affect change in these supply chains. And the final question that I want to address is one around the harms that are being wrought in the supply chains that we're interested in. And so I think it is fair to say that while I think we're all familiar with the spectrum of issues, from corruption to the loss of revenue to environmental degradation and human rights abuses that we know to exist in some of these supply chains, I think it is to the merit of any report into these issues to identify what the specific harms are and how we can bring those to life for our audiences in a way that feels meaningful. I think there's also something to be said for really understanding some of the context in which these things sit and being able to press when, for instance, the production of a given mineral has an outsized impact on a watercourse as compared to a comparable alternative. I think I say that partly because it's fairly well acknowledged that there are going to be, as Dr. Shen was addressing earlier, sustainable mining is a difficult concept. is an inherently extractive and almost, certainly polluting activity. So understanding the detail and getting into the weeds of like, what are the specific cases that we're looking at, I think is important. And I wanted to share a little bit more on this example of rare earth mining in Myanmar. So this report that we published in 2022 was a really fascinating one for our team, and has gained quite a lot of traction in the broader kind of journalistic sphere. There was a BBC podcast that followed shortly after called The Scramble for Rare Earths, where our report formed quite an important part of the evidence base. And it has demonstrated a few things. And one of them is that actually, sometimes through some of this reporting, I think we can really add to the understanding of these supply chains in a very meaningful sense. So as I said, we found that our evidence ran contra to what was being published by the USGS, and that when we really dug into it, it stood up. It wasn't that we had got our numbers wrong in the first instance, it was that we had more up-to-date information, and that the reason for that was that this mining activity had expanded so quickly, as I say, that official statistics hadn't quite kept pace. And what you're seeing here on the left-hand side is an image that I hope can bring some of it to life for you. It shows a large kind of pond on the left-hand side, which is a distillation pond that's used for leaching rare earths. You have in the foreground this massive pile of ammonium sulfate, which is used as the leaching agent. And essentially what happens is that within these rich clay mountains, ammonium sulfate is pumped in at the top and extracted into these ponds. And as a result, there is wide-scale chemical alteration to the landscape. There's huge clearance of land. You can't quite see it in this image, but in the background, you can see a great big Komatsu digger clearing another plateau on one of the neighboring mountains. And in this case, building these mines has been quite cheap and quite quick. And as a result, they've just expanded, they've proliferated at this extraordinary rate. We use satellite imagery in this case to try and get a sense of what that rate looked like. And we found that despite there being little to no pools of this nature in the landscape, it's about the area of Singapore, in 2015, 2016, by the time we published the report, there were 2,700 pools like this that had been excavated and extracted. And the rare earths that were being traded across the border had come to represent in the region of 50% of China's feedstock. And so, yeah, we brought that evidence together. We also worked together with partners on the ground, and it's a military-controlled area, and therefore one that's quite hard to establish partnerships in, and source protection is paramount. But this image on the right is the closest we got to representing the affected communities, and it's a letter to the military demanding the military who control this particular area, demanding the halting of rare earth mining. And some of the harms that it documents includes, total devastation of the watercourses, to such an extent that people's skin feel fizzy when they walk through the rivers. They've lost crops in abundance. It's really been, totally devastating to the communities in this part of Myanmar. And through our report, we really attempted to do justice to some of that, and we have continued to engage with the partners that we worked with. But one of the things that I think has been positive beyond the media coverage is that there's been significant interest from the OECD and also from certain partners in China to try and address essentially claims by those same downstream companies that I was talking about moments ago, the car manufacturers, that they're not at all implicated. So the response that came back when we published this report was either silence, or it was the claim that the companies were relying entirely on recycled rare earths. And I think we touched a bit on recycling earlier, but if that is something that comes up in any of the work or investigations that anyone else here does, I would really encourage a critical lens on the realities of some of the capacity for recycling in some of these supply chains at the moment. And so it's true that some of these technologies are so recent, or so recent in their growth, that a lot of the feedstock doesn't necessarily exist for recycling. We're not, where copper's concerned, I think about 4 or 5 out of the 25 million tons that we have every year is recycled, because we've been using it for decades. Where you're talking about permanent magnets, that's simply not the case. And it's also not the case that effective technology exists for that recycling. So that kind of meaningful engagement, I think, is one way that we can, we've sought to try and shift the situation in this case. And another is by ongoing monitoring. So again, I think this is something that came through in Giraud's talk, or at least at the end when he mentioned some of the data that they're making available. But one of the kind of themes that has come up a few times for us is it's not really enough to just publish a report. You compile all this evidence, you publish a report and you say, okay, at this moment in time, here's a snapshot of what was happening. Because some of these things are moving so quickly that actually there is a need for ongoing monitoring, there is a need for live information and for, up-to-date intel on what's happening. And so, again, one of the things we've done here is we've taken the work that we did up front to identify where those mines are and how they've expanded, and we've kept it running so that we can stay in touch with local partners, and where a local partner is concerned that perhaps a new mine is being developed, we can provide corroborative evidence for that, or not, as the case may be. But that's a further thought on that. I don't know quite how we're doing for time. 15 minutes, 10 minutes, perfect. So that's all from me. Thank you very much for listening. And I'd be really keen to hear any questions or comments that anyone might have with similar experiences that they've had digging into these issues. Equally, very happy to follow up. If anyone is interested in any of the data sets I've talked about or the approaches, please do email me at any time and I'll happily share.
Thanks, that was really interesting. I just wanted to add.
Sorry, we'll just send a microphone to you.
Sorry, I'm Shantha. Thank you, that was very informative and very useful advice. I just wanted to sort of share some perspective from Zimbabwe, where I work. You mentioned the Australian mines that do the exploring, and I think I am also Australian and grew up in Perth, where a lot of them are headquartered. I think it's a very important piece of what's happening in the continent. There are a huge amount of juniors, as they're called, and what they do is they often partner with, prospective, they get the prospective rights to explore, and then they will list on the Australian or the Canadian Stock Exchange and raise capital. Some of them are more genuine than others. I mean, some of them really do invest in the geological research and proving that the mine is valuable. Some of them do more speculation, try and make some quick money. What happened with Prospect Resources, which is the company that developed Arcadia, which was then bought by Hunan Cobalt, was that they, it was a 5-year journey. They listed and they were trying to prove that the deposits were valuable, and they were also trying to raise capital to invest in the mine. But it was very, very extremely difficult to do. Perception of risk in Zim was very high. They did raise, I think, 50 million, but they really needed a lot more money to invest in the full-scale production. So eventually they sold it last year for $500 million, or 400,000 US dollars, which predominantly was offshore. I mean, that's the way it works. That money goes to the investors on the Australian Stock Exchange and not back to the country. So if anyone wonders why West Australia is a very rich state, a lot of it is because they go and look for the dirt in Africa, and then a lion's share doesn't, the investors are not in Zimbabwe. And now, obviously, the government has banned lithium exports. And what was happening was there was a lot, there's two, obviously, big mines now that are investing in processing as part of the ban on the raw export of lithium. But what we had was also a lot of opportunistic lithium shipment going on by relatives of certain people, and, just huge trucks of dirt basically being sent through Beira. And I think for the most part that has stopped. Obviously, it's all who has the power to get through the border. But I think that was interesting. So there was a lot of informal push for people to benefit. And obviously Zim has a big artisanal gold sector now, which, has, it happens in different shapes or forms, as well as the formal gold mining sector. But lithium, as you said, is heavy it's big rocks, and it's bad to be shipping raw dirt to China for processing. But I think it is important just to echo that you need to look at who's exploring for those minerals, because that's really where, the Chinese big companies aren't investing until they know the dirt is worthwhile digging. And so there's two phases to that exploration.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for that comment and question. Do we have any other questions or comments for Ben?
You seem to have quite a bit of confidence in the regulatory systems of the West that over the stock exchange guidance, the reportings that have to be done, and also this idea that the brands, BMW and others, have reputational risk concerns. The evidence doesn't seem like it supports that. We all know that in our phones here that there's cobalt that's mined with child labor. Apple, Tesla, all of them have done nothing. They're absorbing the reputational risk. The Western governments know exactly what's happening. They have not sanctioned any of the companies for the most part. Glencore got hit, but that was really the outlier. So I'm just curious why you think the OECD, the brands, the West in general, is as competent in enforcing this when the evidence doesn't seem to support that at all.
Should we take another one, or do you want to
I can tackle
respond?
that.
Do we have another question? I guess we can allow you to respond, and then if there's any further, we'll take another round. Okay.
Thanks. Thank you. I'd like to clarify that I don't have tremendous confidence in the regulatory frameworks of the West, and certainly not in the stock exchanges. I wanted to highlight that they exist because I think they are a vehicle that should be explored, and that awareness of those regulatory frameworks is useful, if only insofar as it clarifies what information is being made available and why, and what format that follows and where it falls down. And I think in particular the way that it becomes formulaic and becomes this kind of off the shelf environmental impact assessment that isn't effectively considered. But I don't necessarily think that that is going to result in any meaningful change for producer countries. Where the brands are concerned, I totally take your point also, and I see that it's entirely insufficient, the changes that have been made by these companies. I think often the problem exists where there's a kind of a collective responsibility almost. It's like, this is too big an issue, we can't shift it, so we're all just implicated, and that allows certain companies to almost hide in the in the intractability of the problem. And I do think there is a case to be made for identifying where specific companies in these supply chains do play an outsized role in driving demand for specific minerals, and given the diversity of some of these supply chains, also where companies are sourcing from more problematic sources. So where Tesla, for instance, is building highly nickel-reliant batteries that therefore encourage further proliferation of high-pressure acid leaching in Indonesia. I think that is a problem that deserves to be targeted, and that there is a case to be made. I'm not sure how robust for targeted pressure on individual companies there. And yeah, where the OECD is concerned, perhaps it's setting standards too low to kind of stop there. I'm not suggesting we do, but I do think it's important to explore those vehicles. And where rare earth mining is concerned, and that's the issue that I was talking about in relation to the OECD, it's an issue that is essentially ignored. So for there to be any scrutiny on it at all is a step in the right direction of sorts. I don't mean to suggest that it's the end game, but I do think it merits exploration. And I think if it can bring a bit of scrutiny onto something that is kind of considered to be a black box, it's like, oh yeah, we buy it from China, we don't know where it comes from, we don't make it our business. I think the burden of proof should be shifted in those supply chains, and it should be the case that a company can't just say, oh yeah, we buy recycled stuff, and that's it. I think, you know, if those vehicles can create a space in which there is more scrutiny and more, more stringent requirements for reporting, that's a positive thing. But yeah, I don't think that it's enough.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Ben. Do we have any other questions? We've got one question at the back. You can go ahead, Tom.
Yes, thanks so much, Ben. I thought it was really fascinating. I just have a question which I think would be useful for people here. I mean, people in the crowd, like, shake your heads vigorously if you think I'm wrong here, but I think for a lot of journalists, and I include myself in that, we know that there's a lot of this kind of public information on companies and data on trade and so on available. We know that that's available, but it can often feel quite intimidating to learn how to access that and use it, and also to feel confident in the conclusions that we are making from it. Just, do you have suggestions about how we might be able to up our skills on that, or if there's other things such as sort of collaborations with organizations such as yourselves or others who are more, you know, more in the weeds on data analysis and investigations?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. So I was trying to get at that in a way through some of the recommendations I made, because I think there's a real proliferation of information in this space, and you can make life easier for yourself by narrowing down the sources that you rely on. And I think official geological surveys like the USGS, I think the IEA is a useful place to start. As I say, I wouldn't take everything that is published as definitive, but if you're citing it and you're being clear about your sources, it's good. And yes, I would totally encourage anybody who's interested in the space but feels a bit baffled by the universe of data and information to approach us. We've done quite a lot of digging on this, and I'd be happy to help personally. I think it's also fair to say that quite a lot of there's a large moderate commercial space in terms of information providers, a lot of which are catering to industry, but I think have an appetite to try and better support good process. And so there are, I would, if you're looking at something, one of these data sets, I would always encourage you to contact the provider as well, and get their explanation of how they put their information together, what they're relying on. They will always explain the source. That in itself can be a bit of a burden and one that you might not want to undertake, but there are plenty of people, I think, that would be happy to help if you are in that space. And also, I think there's something to be said for shared resources on this stuff. Like, some of it does take a long time to download and retrieve and organize, and actually working together in partnership can ease the burden of some of that stuff. So I think more of that is good and prevents conflicting conclusions being drawn by partnering organizations with similar aims. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks, Ben. If we don't have any other questions, then I think we're good to close the session. So I'm just trying to see if we have any other questions, and then we can move forward to the next section. All right, so thank you. Thank you once again, Ben, for those reflections. Thank you for that insight on the practical experience that you've had and the work that Global Witness is doing, which is quite crucial. Thank you so much for offering us that example, and we look forward to learning further from you. And I think your suggestion on partnerships and collaborations is quite a crucial one, and I hope the journalists with us will reach out to you for those opportunities, and as well as the report that you've built from Global Witness. So thank you so much for that, and let's give him a round of applause.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.